For years, there's been a debate as to what was the largest tax increase in the history of the United States. With the opinion of the Supreme Court as to the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, we now know that that piece of legislation created the largest tax increase in the history of the United States, at least $500 billion and perhaps significantly more. Everyone has been waiting for this opinion because many things that will affect the future of our state as well as our country depended on the upholding or the striking down of provisions of this particular act. The legislation that gave rise to this litigation, of course, was one that was hotly debated in the Congress of the United States, and I am sure, in light of this opinion, that debate will continue with regard to either modifications or continued efforts to repeal the legislation itself. From a state perspective, we do know that the portion that related directly to the mandated expansion of Medicaid populations by states, there was at least an area of indication that it was not an absolute mandate. The discretion for a state to participate in the expansion of Medicaid was a door that was left open, the court saying that that would have been an unconstitutional mandate on states. As you know, the original legislation threatened that if you did not accept the mandate for expanding the Medicaid coverage up to, in our case, 138% of the federal poverty level, that you would have lost your federal participation in your existing Medicaid program. The court has indicated that that leverage and that coercion was not appropriate. Some of you have received some information that we asked OPB to assemble with regard to a proposed expansion under the legislation of our state Medicaid program. The best figures that we can come up with is that it would require an additional 620,000 people be added to the Georgia Medicaid rolls in 2014, with that mandated number expanding to approximately 695,000 by the year 2023. That 620,000 additional individuals in the state Medicaid rolls represents about a 34% increase in Georgia's Medicaid population. That, of course, means that the percent of Georgians as a whole who are on Medicaid will rise from its current 17.6% of our population to approximately 24.2% in 2014. The cost of that expansion, of course, are significant. Now, I want to thank some individuals for their help to the state of Georgia in this undertaking with regard to contesting the constitutionality of this legislation. Of course, first of all, our state Attorney General Sam Olens has been at the tip of the spear from the standpoint of Georgia's contesting of this legislative action, and he has had the assistance of a very notable and extensive list of private attorneys who have provided pro bono legal services and have saved the state of Georgia and the taxpayers of our state literally tens of thousands of dollars in legal expense. I personally want to thank that group of lawyers for their help in this undertaking and express my appreciation to our Attorney General for the leadership that he's provided. That's a very quick overview of where we are. Let me open it up to your questions and I'll attempt to answer. Yes.
Governor, do you have plans or to encourage the legislature one way or another as to whether or not we should expand our Medicaid rolls as the law allows, but without a penalty now, apparently, if we don't?
That is something that we will certainly continue to look at. There are a lot of unanswered questions in that regard. For example, if we do decide to participate in the Medicaid expansion, which under the legislation requires the federal government to pay 100% of the cost of that expanded population for the first 3 years and 90% thereafter. The question is, suppose the state of Georgia does agree to the expanded population group, and do we then have the right at some future point in time to withdraw and go back to the level of coverage that we currently provide? Those are questions we don't know the answer to. We will continue to be exploring those kinds of things. It's too early to be able to say at this point in time. Yes, sir.
With the exchange expanding, can you comment on how Georgia is progressing in implementing the exchange program?
Well, as you know, we have initially had a study commission that was at work looking at possible exchange models for the state of Georgia. We decided to suspend that and did not ask the General Assembly to continue with a legislative enactment that would have authorized those exchanges to go forward under a state model. There were several reasons for that. One was the uncertainty of that mandate itself. Now, of course, that mandate has stood. The question then remains whether the state of Georgia would be better off with a model that is designed by the state of Georgia. And if so, what flexibility do we have at the state level to craft an exchange that might better suit our citizens? Or are we going to be better off with a federally imposed and federally orchestrated and run exchange program? We will be looking at those questions and trying to determine the answers. And obviously, the elections in November will determine a lot of these decisions that will have to be made by the state at some point in time. With regard to those elections, we can then make a judgment call as to whether or not there's going to be significant legislative action to repeal or modify significantly this legislation that has now been approved by the court.
So is it fair to say we're not going to see any movement until the election?
We are probably just going to be in a holding pattern until such time as we see what the events of November bring us. The legislature, of course, will be going in session the first part of next year, and they will have adequate time to be able to put in place, if necessary, state legislation to deal with that subject.
Governor, can you explain to us why you've decided not to use the foreclosure fraud settlement money to help the people hardest hit by foreclosures?
I'm not going to spend any time on that one other than to say that the judgment of my office and the judgment of the legislature was that the best way to deal with help foreclosure victims is to make sure they have jobs, and that's where we put the money.
You have to decide by mid-November whether the state of Georgia will do a health information or health insurance exchange. The election is November 2nd. Assuming there's a Republican victory, it could take some time to see repeal or whatnot. You mentioned that you're going to wait till November to make these decisions. So as a practical matter, what are you going to do on the health insurance exchange portion? We face a November 16th decision. What are you going to do about that?
Well, for one thing, we can act a whole lot quicker than the federal government can, or a court opinion that we've been waiting on now for quite a while. It is a short window that we will have to make some decisions in that regard. We will continue to be working with the State Insurance Commissioner's Office, who certainly has a say and an input in this process. But right now, I don't think we know. As you may recall, when we first started the committee to investigate and look at what would a state exchange program look like, at that point in time, nobody knew what the mandated coverages that an exchange insurance policy would have to include. As we started that process, suddenly CMS started putting out regulations trying to define what those benefits had to be. I'm not confident that we know even now what the final coverage package is going to have to look like and what it's going to include. So as long as that part is in limbo, it really leaves everybody in a quandary as to exactly how you would approach it from a state standpoint. But as I say, we're not going to be able to make those decisions until later.
Governor, a lot of unanswered questions right now in terms of, where do we go from here? Is Georgia prepared to enact this law or go forward with it in terms of, are we able to expand the Medicaid rolls? It's a lot more people on these rolls. And what does it mean for the insured and the uninsured here in Georgia?
Well, first of all, from the state perspective, it is a significant increase in funding that's going to be required. According to OPB's estimate, if these changes remain in effect, it will be somewhere in the neighborhood of $620+ million additional money that we would have to have rolled into our state program. $620 million is a large amount of money, and one that would be very difficult for our departments to have to absorb. Part of that is directly related to the language of the statute. Part of it is a woodworking effect of people who might already be eligible but have not enrolled in our current Medicaid program. There are a number of variables that make up the total cost of that package. Now, your question with regard to what does that mean for the citizens of the state of Georgia? Well, it means that we will be in a posture of trying to either comply with the federal statute by way of expanding the state Medicaid population base, or even with that happening, insurance policies issued by private insurance companies as to their mandated expansion of coverage in order to be able to participate in a federal exchange program. All of those are questions that I think over the next several months we're going to see debated at every level, and I think it's way too early to know exactly what the outcome is going to be there.
Governor, do you anticipate that there's room for a regional multi-state exchange at this point, or today is it too hard to talk about that idea?
Well, you know, that's been one of the suggestions that states ought to band together in a regional concept in terms of putting together an exchange. The state of Georgia, as you know, took the step to allow sale across state lines of insurance policies. I believe the latest information I have from the State Insurance Commissioner is that no company has taken us up on that offer. So whether or not that's an indication that there is no interest, perhaps, of sharing in that kind of multi-state exchange, I don't know. I think it's an idea that is worth exploring, however.
Have you had a chance to speak with any other governors today?
No, I have not.
Governor, your exchange commission recommended an exchange for small businesses. Will that impact the state's decision as to going forward?
Let me make a correction I've been handed here. I was reading my charts wrong. I said 620,000. That's the number of people that will be expanded. The cost is estimated in fiscal year 14 to be $76.3 million. So that is the correct cost. Your question with regard to recommending an exchange for small businesses. I have always felt that we should make some accommodation for small businesses to be able to pool their individual members in such a fashion as to achieve a better rating and a better premium rate for their participation in a group plan. I am still supportive of that concept. The question that I do not know the answer to is whether or not we would be allowed to do that with CMS regulations and carving those out into a special category in an exchange program. I think it has merit, and if it is available for a state to be able to do that, I would certainly think we would look at that option as part of a package if the state does design its own exchange program.
When I was talking to some of the Tea Party folks outside, they want you to just, as someone who voted against this earlier, as opposed to, they want you to use your executive authority to block implementation whenever possible, to try and layer towards it. Is that something you're interested in doing? Is that something you legally can do?
Well, I think the court has made it very clear that there are only certain areas that states have choices about. And the one big area that we have a choice about is, as I explained, whether we participate in the expansion of the state Medicaid program to include up to 138% of the federal poverty level, which would include that extra 620,000 people. That's pretty much the only big area of discretion that I see that's vested in the states.
Governor, is there any question on the table that might require a special session of the legislature this fall?
I don't see anything that might require a special session this fall. If I were to look down the road a little bit, though, I'm not quite as certain about requiring a special legislative session later next year, because depending on the elections in November and actions that may take place in Washington in the early part of next year, we're probably going to be finished with our 2014 budget before we know the answers to those questions that only Congress and the White House can provide. Now, if something major happened after we have adjourned in our regular legislative session next year, then that would be one of those kind of situations that might require a special session. Let's hope not. I will do everything in my power to avoid that, and we will be looking at all the options in order to try to anticipate what changes, if any, might be coming from the federal government during that time frame. I do not, however, see any anticipation on my part that we would need a special legislative session between now and the end this year and the beginning of the regular session. Although, as pointed out previously by the question, there is a narrower window with regard to the exchanges.
Can you make that decision yourself between now and Can you make that decision yourself between the election and November 16th?
I would probably do that in consultation with the leadership of the General Assembly before we make those kind of major steps.
You don't think it would need an act of the legislature?
I think to implement a model that would be contrary to the model that the federal statute outlines, it would take state legislative action. Now, I would assume that since our legislature is not in regular session but would be imminently to convene, I would anticipate that surely we could get some leniency from CMS with regard to allowing our legislature to consider that. Whether they act on it or not, obviously we don't know.
Governor, how real is the possibility that you might not recommend an expansion of the rolls, of Medicaid rolls, to 138% of the poverty level?
Well, my personal opinion has always been very clear that I think that is a mistake. However, the taxpayers of the state of Georgia will be paying as federal taxpayers to support the expansion of other states to include a greater portion of other states' population base. And if ours are excluded, that is certainly a question that we would have to ask if that is proven. But it's still too early for me to make a judgment call on that.
Governor, were you surprised by the decision today?
I was surprised by the decision. I quite honestly felt that the issue of the constitutionality of the individual mandate was one that the court had given pretty strong signals that they had problems with. It is somewhat ironic to me that it is now held constitutional, not because it is a proper exercise of the power of the federal government under the Commerce Clause, but that it is appropriate only because of the federal exercise of taxation authority over the states and over its citizens. Now, that's why I said, if we really want to know what the largest tax increase is, we have just now been given that opinion by the Supreme Court. It is this piece of legislation that, ironically, is called the Affordability Act.
Can we
In light of the revenue pressures, do you see this court ruling as hurting some of these other agencies? You're going to have to find money somewhere.
Well, we have to come up with $76.3 million extra dollars in addition to what we already fund for Medicaid. Yes, it will put a strain on the state's budget and will be one of those areas of concern. But like everything else, in tough economic times, you have to decide what your priorities are, and safety of the public always has to be one of our top priorities. Thank you all for being here today.
Governor, can you explain real quickly how exactly the money is going to be used in the foreclosure fraud settlement?
Well, first of all, even though my former colleagues in Congress have written their letter urging me to put the money into credit counseling and things like that, I would have to say and remind them that this was a private settlement. It was not federal money that they passed or appropriated. It was a private settlement with 5 major banks. Something over $700 million has gone to individuals who were the victims of foreclosure and for the purposes that they have suggested we spend the state's portion for. The state portion, slightly under $100 million, was a very small portion of the overall settlement. And we believe the best way to spend that is to be able to create jobs, not only for those who've lost their jobs because and resulted in foreclosure of their homes, but also to be able to prevent that same fate from happening to others.
You say create jobs. How exactly will that money be used to create jobs?
It has been appropriated to the 2 major sources that we use, the economic development of One Georgia and the REPA fund is where the money was appropriated.
So grants and subsidies, that sort of thing?
That's right.
Governor, are you confident that Mitt Romney will be able to repeal this on day 1?
I'm sorry?
Are you confident that Mitt Romney will be able to repeal this on day 1 like he's promised?
As a former legislator, I am always reminded that that is not the prerogative of any executive. They can recommend and they can put forward legislation, but it's going to require the act of the Congress of the United States that passed the legislation in the first place to pass repealer legislation. But certainly having Governor Romney as the president advocating for that, and hopefully with enough support in both the House and the Senate to get it done, lends great credibility to that statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor.